Hey guys, welcome back to Ken Michaels Radio, where we talk all the time about the Beatles, any part of their history, any part of their music, their group years, their solo years. Back with me here on the channel, we have two very special guests who have been on a few times together. And I know in the case of one of them, Al Sussman, he's come on solo and on certain panel discussions. We have Bruce Spizer with us. Bruce, you should know, has written so many books on the Beatles on Capitol Records, the Beatles on VJ, the Beatles on Apple from their solo years. And in recent years, he's put out commemorative books that have been coinciding with the archival box sets of Beatle albums from Sgt. Pepper on. And we have his latest book right here called The Beatles, Rubber Soul to Revolver. And also joining Bruce is Al Sussman. At this point, do I really need to introduce Al Sussman? He is
I sort of come, they drag me out of the dinosaur cave every once in a while.
Just like the song Consider Yourself, he's part of the furniture here.
Yes, exactly.
He was part of my podcast show, Things We Said Today, for several years. We go back to all my years on New Jersey radio on WDHA. And he's been a guest on this channel, back on Things We Said Today once in a while. He's also on Talk More Talk, a solo Beatles videocast, my other podcast show. So gentlemen, welcome back to Ken Michaels Radio.
Thanks for having us.
I've really been enjoying this book, like all your books, Bruce. And Al has actually contributed 2 articles for your latest book. I want to start by asking a few very simple and basic questions. But you know, some of the books you cover 1 album, some of your books you cover 2 albums. How do you decide when, certainly in the case of both Rubber Soul and Revolver, a lot of fans would say each one warrants its own book?
I think when I started this, and you have to understand, you do an album series per se, and you're not sure where it's going to go. In other words, when I did the Sgt. Pepper book, it wasn't part of an album series. This was a case of I was going to do a book dealing with Sgt. Pepper. Okay, it came out, and when the book came out, people said, well, Bruce, of course, you have to do a White Album book. And I said, sure, because the White Album is my favorite album. So off it was to do a White Album book. And then the idea, it starts developing into a series at that point. Obviously, you know, Abbey Road, well, you have to give that a separate book, let it be a separate book. And where the combining of albums concept came into play was during COVID. You know, it was at a time where I had already put out my Let It Be book during the anniversary year, unlike Apple and Universal and, you know, and everybody else was pushing things back. And so I thought, well, I need to put out a book. What would be the next thing to do? And logically, my idea was I could do something with Magical Mystery Tour. And it wasn't just Magical Mystery Tour, but why not throw in Yellow Submarine? Because those 2 projects represent the Beatles' productive post-Pepper period, as we say. And so for that reason, those books came out, you know, with, you know, a separate one, but those 2 work well together. And I kind of like the idea of joining them together. And then it was a case of, okay, we have that done. What do I do next? And then it was, well, I'm going to go backwards through the sea of time after Yellow Submarine. And I thought, well, I can do Rubber Soul and Revolver separately. Certainly each of them would merit their own book. But how were things done in the United States of America? Well, you had Rubber Soul, and then you had this Yesterday and Today bridge, and then you had Revolver. And I thought, you know, maybe that would make sense to cover them together. And that was where I got the idea to bring those together. And it seemed to work well. And, you know, and I came across a quote of George Harrison saying, well, Revolver was nothing but Rubber Soul Part 2. I don't know if I necessarily agree with that, but I thought, you know, they're 2 landmark albums by the Beatles for different reasons, perhaps. Rubber Soul has great songs, and Revolver's known for great sounds. And, you know, maybe it would work well in a book. And when I started doing it, I got that impression. Now, I know, Ken, we're not, we're doing this on the fly and not editing, but I'm noticing if those green boxes at the top mean anything, I'm not being shown at all. And either you're being shown and Al is being shown and I'm not being shown, or are you guys seeing me? I can't tell from here.
We see you.
You see me, and when I'm
And-
talking, I'm being seen?
Mhm, yeah.
Okay. That's what I wasn't sure of. Okay.
Okay.
I don't know why people would want to see me, but I just thought I would point that out.
You look fine. Your office
All
looks
right.
fine. Anything looks cleaner than my room.
Okay, so
Or mine.
anyway, we've now covered the idea of, why did I combine those two albums? And I know that the question you're dying to ask me is, well, what's next? Right? Were you dying to ask me that?
Well, I also wanted to know, and you kind of answered the question, but there was a part of me that always felt like you kind of know what the next box set's going to be. And maybe you're going to try and time it with that. But obviously, you got Rubber Soul covered here. And if they're going to do the next box set, likely would be Rubber Soul. And then that won't be till next year anyway. So, but it just seemed like your books were timed, maybe, possibly, to go with the archival box sets. And actually, one of the things that I had brought up in my podcast shows, I was really convinced that the next box set after Let It Be was gonna be Magical Mystery Tour and Yellow Submarine, because they deliberately left out songs from that time period in the box sets. And it's like, come on, it's pretty obvious that you're leaving it, you haven't done this for a reason. So I'd have to believe that that's in the pipeline. And since they were doing the later stuff first, I would have thought they would have tackled Magical Mystery Tour and Yellow Submarine before Revolver. But evidently I was wrong.
And it's not like I, have a pipeline into Apple and I call up Apple and I say, Apple, what are you doing next? I do what I think logically makes sense. And if Apple independently and I independently reach the same conclusion, that works out great. I put out the Magical Mystery Tour Yellow Submarine, and would it have been nice if Apple Universal had done something? Of course, but the fact that they didn't in my mind make my project any less relevant. And so I just do what makes sense to me. And I grew up in America, so I'm looking at how things were done in America and also in the UK. And I'm trying to do that in one book. And that was the main reason Rubber Soul and Revolver got linked, was I just felt that if I linked those albums, that was where you put Yesterday and Today. Otherwise, I guess you could have put it just with Revolver, but then it's got 4 tracks from Rubber Soul. So that was kind of my thinking.
And so for everyone watching that's not aware, as Bruce mentioned, the book does cover Yesterday and Today, and there's quite a bit on the Butcher cover as well. And he also covers the American and UK releases for Rubber Soul and Revolver. Going back, let's start here with Rubber Soul. I remember in one of our conversations, we were talking about Meet the Beatles here, and how when that album exploded here in America, and we basically had just top 40 radio to play this music, we're not just playing I Want to Hold Your Hand and I Saw Her Standing There. There were plenty of stations that were playing All My Lovin'. There were some stations that were playing the whole album and even listed it on their charts as the hit, an entire album. Right. But what you wrote in your book here reminded me of that with Rubber Soul, because of the fact that Michelle was getting a lot of airplay on top 40 radio, even though it wasn't released as a single by the Beatles. And you also go on to say that where Revolver is concerned, part of the reason why the Beatles felt that they should release the single of Yellow Submarine and Eleanor Rigby is because there were so many cover versions coming out of the songs from Revolver. Why shouldn't they have a hit with it? I love the fact that you illustrated 5 cover versions of Michelle there, all at the same time, that all came out on single. But, talk about that a bit, because I'm sure there must have been, the Beatles had their own set policy, at least in the UK, as we all know, that they wanted their singles and albums to be separate, with a few exceptions, A Hard Day's Night and Help and the Please Please Me album. But with Eleanor Rigby and Yellow Submarine, they felt that they had to release it as a single, well, at least in part because so many people were covering their material anyway.
And I think if you look at what happened with Rubber Soul, it's an interesting album because when Capitol puts their album together, you know, they know we're going to do 11 or 12 songs, not 14. So they're going to be differences. And what really makes the album unique is that Capitol comes out and says, well, wait a minute, you know, we've got these leftover tracks. I've Just Seen a Face and It's Only Love, and they're great songs. Why don't we put that on Rubber Soul? And they make that decision to do so. And, you know, and they don't say, well, gee, we can work it out in Day Tripper on this album to sell it. By this point, Capitol has enough confidence in the Beatles. We're going to move away from our philosophy. Hit singles make hit albums. And so they move away from that, and they drop 4 tracks from the album, and they make sure at least one of them is going to be a follow-up single, like Nowhere Man, you know, duh, that sounds like a hit single to us. And so that's kind of how they program the album for Rubber Soul, and it ends up having this cohesive rock sound. In the meantime, Michelle is getting a ton of radio airplay. Capitol cannot justify pulling it from the album as a single because they've got Day Tripper, we can work it out as a single. So that's kind of what happens there. And then as soon as they can, they rush out Nowhere Man as a single. So, you know, then when we get to Revolver, you know, we'll talk about Yesterday and Today later, but when we get to Revolver, Capitol is planning on releasing a single with Eleanor Rigby, Yellow Submarine. And, you know, the UK is aware of it. And they realize, you know, hey, that's not really a bad idea. We don't need to do that. But if we did that, that would kind of stop, you know, a bunch of cover versions of at least 2 of those tracks from coming out. And, you know, and George liked the logic behind it, you know, because Harrison's thinking, well, yeah, you know, we might as well get the hit. So it was really rushed released out that people weren't aware of it until, you know, literally most people weren't aware of it till a couple of days before the single came out, that there was going to be a single in the UK of Yellow Submarine and Eleanor Rigby.
Very interesting. I love the fact that in your books, not just this one, but all of them, you really load it with chart information. I mean, you've got every chart there in the US and the UK. Why do you feel it's that important to, you know, to list every single one of them? I've always been a Billboard man myself, and, you know, I have a lot of the stats there memorized in my brain, as Al will tell you. But, you know, I love the fact that you put that in there just to at least illustrate the success across the board on the different charts.
And I think also you get to some of the singles where something might be a #1 hit in Cashbox or, you know, Record World, but wasn't a #1 hit in Billboard. So it's kind of important to say, hey, you know, like this was a #1 hit, may not have been in Billboard, but it did hit #1 on 1 or 2 of the other charts. So that's important. And then Cashbox had a feature, a thing called a radioactive chart, which I liked because it would tell you, you know, what stations or what percentage of stations were reporting these songs or adding these songs to their playlist. And I found that fascinating. Particularly, it gave you an idea of when radio were getting these records, you know, like a week or so in advance. And also, were the B-sides really getting airplay? So, you know, you might have a situation where it might say, okay, well, you know, 40% of the reporting stations are playing this B-side, or it might be as high as 80% of the stations are playing the B-side. So I kind of like getting into that radioactive chart because it gave information that you wouldn't have received in Billboard. Well, Billboard's just giving you a number. So Cashbox have multiple charts, and I like taking advantage of that radioactive chart.
And in the early 70s, when Mark Lapidus and I were working at Sam Goody in Paramus, we used Cashbox's Top 100 as the chart where we had the 45s laid out. We used the Cashbox chart rather than Billboard. So at that, you know, because at that time, it was, I think the thinking was that that Cashbox's chart was a little bit more less industry oriented.
Okay. You know, still to this day, there are radio programs that I listen to with countdowns, and they use Cashbox. It's not all Billboard like American Top 40 with Casey Kasem is. But
Right. Well, I mean, they don't use Cashbox anymore because
no, but I mean,
Cashbox.
when they look back at charts from
Oh, yes. Yeah, absolutely.
use Cashbox a lot.
Right.
I mean, I think it's important to kind of get an overview, and also, I brought in a lot of the local charts, in different cities.
Mm,
When, I didn't bother saying, well, Yellow Submarine was #1 in the following, 35 cities, that'd be kind of silly. But when we were talking about oddball stuff, like, you had some stations that listed Michelle as #1, or they might say #1 this week was Michelle, Day Tripper, and We Can Work It Out.
right.
Or, Girl might have been #1 tied with Michelle. I mean, so I like taking that to see what the local markets were doing, because it gave insight into, because we weren't in, the days where it was homogenous programming throughout the country. I mean, each
Exactly.
market could do something totally different, and in each
Yeah.
city. I mean, in New Orleans, it was kind of funny because you look at the charts and, WTIX might have I'm a Believer at #1 by the Monkees, and WNOE might have I'm Not Your Stepping Stones as #1. So it was
Yeah.
always fun to look at, at the charts. And in the UK, some of the charts had it listed as Eleanor Rigby / Yellow Submarine, and others had Yellow Submarine / Eleanor Rigby.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The same thing with Day Tripper and We Can Work It Out in the UK. Some charts had Day Tripper first, others had We Can Work It Out first. So
Right.
that's why I like to throw out all the information.
It's very easy to take a look at the national charts, because I always think, We Can Work It Out was the bigger hit, which it was overall over Day Tripper. But like you said, there are certain areas where Day Tripper was more the hit. And it's nice to see, going back to one of your earlier books, I always like to bring up that station in Massachusetts where I'll Get You was the hit over She Loves
Yeah.
You. You always remember the station, so
WORC.
what's that?
WORC.
Okay. That's Worcester, right?
Yep.
Okay.
Worcester,
Mm.
Mass.
All right. Do you remember your initial reactions to listening to Rubber Soul? And I also want to ask you, because every now and then, because I was, let's see, 6 years old when Rubber Soul came out. As Beatle music came out, and I bought them all fairly close to their release dates, everything seemed like, at least to a little kid, a fairly smooth transition. I didn't see that big a difference.
Mm-mm.
I'm just saying, to me, for a little kid, it was only when you got really weird tracks like I Am the Walrus or A Day in the Life or something like that, that I stopped and thought, this is really different. But what was it like for both?
Michael's thought Tomorrow Never Knows was typical top 40 fare.
Yeah, of course. Of course.
I don't know. I didn't flinch all that much with Tomorrow Never. I mean, now when I listen to it, yes, I notice the difference. But what was it like for you guys as, well, teenagers then, to hear Rubber Soul for the first time? Was it so obvious a difference?
We'll refer to Al
Bruce,
first
go
on
ahead.
that one.
Go ahead.
Al,
Bruce.
yeah, I insist.
All right. Okay. Well, I was eating up all of that stuff at that point, not only the Beatles, but the British Invasion and the American bands and all. I was eating all of that up with a spoon. And so when Rubber Soul came out, I loved it. It's still probably one of my 3 favorite Beatles albums. I don't rank them. I mean, it's an album, at least the American, either the American version or the UK version, I love to death. But I did play the American version for some friends in my neighborhood, and they were like, why did they change? It's different. It's not Beatles music, and it was even more so with Revolver. But I, no question about it, I loved it then and I love it now.
Yeah. And I always remember, I bring up her name every now and then, Candy Leonard, when
Sure.
she discussed in her book Beatleness that there were a lot of teenagers back then that couldn't adjust to the changes the Beatles were making.
Exactly.
And Monkeys were much more
accessible,
digestible, whatever.
Yeah.
it wasn't as much. They were picking up where the Beatles left off with Help,
Right.
that
Yeah.
period. So
Right. Or Herman's Hermits before the Monkees
yeah.
were more for the especially the young girl fans were definitely more accessible.
Hmm.
I mean, what I remember when Rubber Soul first came out was it was this double assault of, you know, you'd heard for a few days before Day Tripper, We Can Work It Out, or maybe a week in advance. So you had this great single, and then all of a sudden this album comes out at, you know, pretty much the same release day. And you know, the radio in New Orleans, like everywhere else or most other markets, really jumped on Michelle. So you had you know, to me, Rubber Soul was accessible, if for no other reason, Michelle, but also, you know, you put the stylus down on that turntable and you've got this great opening, you know, guitar work on I've Just
Mm.
Seen a Face. And, you know, and from there it just snowballs. I mean, when I first heard you know, Norwegian Wood, I didn't fully understand what it was about. And
Yeah.
Sleep in the Bath, that seems kind of strange, you know, where, you
Mhm.
know, it's things like that. So it seems strange to me, to put it mildly. And where I had the most fun though with Rubber Soul and where I really began to appreciate it was in 1969. And at that time, I would have been about 14. And my mother got me a real stereo player. And so,
Oh.
you know, I'd had the Beatle albums in mono, but I began, you know, using my saved up allowance to go back and get them in stereo. And one of the first stereo albums I bought for a rebuy was Rubber Soul. And I had a control on it where I could go all the way to the left or the right channel.
Yeah.
And with Rubber Soul, you could hear
Yeah.
nothing but the music,
Mhm.
which was kind of cool because you really heard more of the subtleties, or go all the way to the other side and hear all the words. And for, you know, a kid, you know, with that going through, well, by then I was past puberty, but all that other stuff, you know, I'm listening to Girl all the way on the vocals and I'm hearing Beatles singing what, yeah, they really are singing tit, tit, tit,
Yeah.
tit. Oh, that's really cool. And so I'd invite friends of mine over and we had the biggest laugh out of that and thought it was so cool. So I kind of, as much as Rubber Soul was good when it came out to me, you know, I really rediscovered it when I listened to it in stereo, even though its stereo mix is probably by today's standards, the worst of all the stereo mixes.
Yeah.
But
Mm.
as a kid, it was great. And
Yeah,
the other thing, you know, seriously, when you talk about Rubber Soul, I mean, the songs are just so great.
Yeah.
well, that's the
That's
thing, I love production. Production matters a lot to me, but for the hundreds or thousands of times I've listened to the Beatles music, group or solo, it's always about the songs first. And it doesn't mean that
no
the
question.
production doesn't matter or what the Beatles brought to their music doesn't matter. Of course it matters. But over half the time, I'm singing along with the music and I'm not really listening that carefully to every little nuance. Um,
Mhm.
and I think that a lot of stereo mixes of that time weren't that good. And I wouldn't have known. I wouldn't have known at that time as a little kid if I had mono or stereo because I had a little, it was, a turntable with speakers right next to it that you carry all in one unit. So they were,
Mhm.
just a few feet apart. So what am I going to know from a stereo mix and a mono mix? I wouldn't have been able to tell the difference. But some of those stereo mixes weren't that good. And a lot of people now, not saying everybody, but a lot of people are appreciating what Giles Martin is doing with his remixing of the Beatles catalog. So, but we might save that for later. Anyway, that conversation.
But I'll just say I do appreciate it. So
Uh-huh.
Me too. Me too.
Um, let's talk a little bit about yesterday and today. And there's quite a lot, as I said before in your book about the Butcher cover. I think part of the reason why Revolver didn't turn my head so much was because we got a little taste of it on yesterday and today with 3 cuts that they took off of it. So something like, the psychedelic stuff, like I'm Only Sleeping, prepared me for
Mhm.
She Said, and Tomorrow Never Knows. So it wasn't like this amazing contrast all at once. When you listen to the British albums next to each other, yeah, what a difference. But I think the mere fact that we had Yesterday and Today in the middle there probably had that kind of an effect on me without my realizing it. But just like everything else, I've said to you guys before that you could have slapped together any 12 songs from the Beatles and got used to the running order of them. And because the songs are strong, that's all that really matters. And you would have gotten used to it. But, it's a good hodgepodge of songs from, Rubber Soul, Revolver, and singles at the time.
I mean, it draws from Help, the album.
Mhm.
It draws from Rubber Soul, and it draws from Revolver. And what I like about it, though, is, the Rolling Stones equivalent of it would be Flowers. And the Rolling Stones equivalent of it, Flowers, has songs that were on other albums as well. Whereas at least with Capitol's Yesterday and Today, all of these songs were in the US making their album debut, unlike Flowers. And that's what the reason I think Yesterday and Today holds up well today, unlike, say, maybe Flowers does, and also it doesn't have filler on it like Flowers did. So I think when you look at it, Yesterday and Today is a well-programmed album. The only thing that, someone could say, well, wait a minute, could we do something different? Yeah, we could have. If Capitol had said, look, we're going to make Revolver a 14-track album in the US. If Capitol had had that mentality then, and they would have had to do that a few months later, because under the new contract with Capitol, with the Beatles, Capitol needed their approval to do anything different. So let's assume that contract took effect, in August. And basically the Beatles said, look, we're not giving you any advanced tracks. Rubber Soul will be 14. Well, Yesterday and Today would have been the same album, but without the 3 preview tracks, you could have Paperback Writer, Rain, and I'm Down. And that would have made a very interesting Yesterday and Today. But as it was, I think Capitol just felt, why do we want to put Paperback Writer and Rain on this album? Let's let that sell strong as a single. And we're going to have, we don't need to put Paperback Writer and Rain. Hit singles make hit albums on Yesterday and Today, because we've got Yesterday, which is a hit single. We've got, We Can Work It Out. We've got Day Tripper. We've got Nowhere Man. We've got the hit singles. And so I think that was Capitol's thinking. And, they really weren't thinking about I'm Down. So, well, yeah, we need 3 more songs. And so 3 would be good, because we're only going to put 11 on the Rubber Soul album anyway, 12 at most, but give us 3 songs. George Martin says, okay. And the 3 songs he gave him, there were only about 5 or 6 tracks available at that time. There was no way George Martin was going to give him Tomorrow Never Knows, and he wasn't going to give him Taxman. And so, when you look at it that way, pretty much those were really the only 3 tracks George Martin could have given them. And unfortunately, they were all John vocals. So it shifts the balance of power for Revolver dramatically, which we can talk about. But, but going back once again to Yesterday and Today.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a really cool album. Capitol said, yeah, okay, well, Drive My Car was good enough to open the UK Rubber Soul. It's good enough to open our album. Fine. It was well programmed. I enjoyed it.
Oh,
I didn't know any better in 1966.
Exactly.
I loved everything back then. I had no discriminating taste when it came to the Beatles. But you do go into in the book why there was that difference between the American and the UK, and why there were less songs, apart from wanting to make more money in the US. But a lot of it had to do with the royalties, because you had to pay for each song in the US, whereas in the UK it was just looked upon as being like 1 unit for an album.
Yeah, what they did was, it was a totally different way of doing publishing. In the US, we had a mechanical license per song, and at the time it was 2 cents per song. So that if you had 14 songs as opposed to 12, that was 4 more cents. And you might say, well, 4 cents, boy, what Capitol's being cheap. Take 4 cents and multiply it by $1 million up, that's $40,000. What's $40,000 today? Over $250,000 adjusted for inflation. So yeah, they weren't just penny ante here and there decisions. Whereas in the UK, you would take an album and divide it by the number of songs, so that the royalty on the publishing was fixed. So for example, if it was for an album, 35 shillings or whatever, then you would take 35 shillings and divide by 12 or divide by 14, depending on the number of songs. So that's why in the UK, having more songs had no effect on the bottom line for a record company.
But then once Sergeant Pepper kicked in and everything was uniform in both countries, then that would mean the US would have to pay more because you're getting more than the 12 songs.
Absolutely.
And certainly with the White Album.
Yes.
Mhm.
But, by that time, when you're making that much money, are you really going to sit there and lament that we lost? When you're making millions, are you going to lament about that 40,000? Probably not.
Hmm.
They didn't have any choice, for one thing.
Okay. Let me talk a bit about the Butcher cover. There's quite a lot that you have in your book about it. I love the fans' reactions because it's kind of mixed. You would think some fans would say this is absolutely horrible, and some fans were totally cool with it. And I enjoyed reading what they had to say about it. But you do say that the reason why it did go out the way it did was because John wanted it that way. And
And look, there's a problem, and it's in so many things, and I think it might even be it might have even carried over into the box set, the wonderful box set, and the wonderful notes from Kevin Howlett when he talks about it. And I know I think it was Q Magazine had that issue, or Mojo, it might have been Mojo. Anyway, Alan Livingston, back in about 2000, I interviewed Alan about the Butcher cover. And Alan explained how Brian called him up and that Brian was insisting that this had to be the cover and that this is what the boys wanted.
Hmm.
And of course, Brian had to do what the boys wanted by that time. And that makes sense. Unfortunately, in a later interview with I think it was in Mojo, Alan Livingston was a year or two older and was a little bit confused. And when he talked about it, he said, well, I had a conversation with Paul about it, and Paul was pushing the Butcher cover. And that has been repeated over and over and over again. And I mentioned it in my book only to point out it's wrong. And, why on earth would the president of Capitol Records be on the phone with a member of the Beatles? He'd be on the phone with the manager of the Beatles. And so clearly that's wrong. John was the one who pushed it. Paul went along with it. But John was the one who pushed it, not Paul. And certainly Brian was the one who had to push it with Capitol Records because that was Brian's job at that point.
Mm-hmm. Do you want to go into how the whole thing was created and why Robert Whitaker did that photo shoot? It's kind of complicated, but you do cover it very well in the book.
Yeah, I think the idea was he just wanted to do a different type of photo session with the Beatles and had all these different ideas. And it wasn't going to be like the Butcher cover was ever going to appear solo on an album. It was going to be with a bunch of other different pictures. And the idea was sort of a false idolatry. And he was going to put halos and fur and all kind of other weird things on this album cover to change things around. And so the idea is Capitol's doing this album, and Capitol informs Brian, hey, we're doing, a Beatles album this summer. It's going to have some leftover tracks in our inventory and some singles. And, we're asking EMI to send us 3, songs from the next album that we need a cover. And Brian remembers that, recently Bob Whitaker had taken a picture of the Beatles in his offices, his NEM's office in London. And it was a case of where the Beatles were going to be there because they were going to be interviewed by this guy from Germany who was doing, an article on them. And his magazine was going to be sponsoring the tour of the Beatles in Germany. So it was an important interview, and the Beatles are there. And Whitaker at the time wanted to be there because he wanted to show them some black and white prints from the Butcher photo session. So he's going to be there. And Brian, look, as long as you all are there, take some pictures of the boys. So there's not much in Brian's office, but a steamer trunk and some other, machine type thing that's in some of the other pictures of it. And he takes that picture. So Brian says, well, I've got that picture. That's fine. That's in my inventory. I can't send him any of the butcher pictures. So he sends him the trunk picture, and Capitol gets it, and they send, and for the first time, Brian really says, I want to see the album cover. Capitol's like, what do you mean you want to see it? So Capitol sends it to Brian. Brian looks at it and he doesn't like it. And he basically says, I don't like that cover. Maybe he didn't like the drapes of his office in it or whatever. And so Capitol comes up with an idea of, well, we'll send him, kind of what it could be. We haven't really have a design, but here's, if we get rid of the background and we have it on a white background, what do you think type thing? And so Brian gets it. And you can see from a picture that's taken at the Paperback Writer Rain outdoor photo shoot or video shoot, Brian has it, and in all likelihood, he shows it to John. And the day before, John has seen Color Butcher Transparencies. And John gets the bright idea, I want that butcher to be the cover. And he tells that to Brian, and Brian is trying to talk him out of it, but gets nowhere. So Brian sends a butcher color transparency to Capitol. George Osaka with the Capitol Art Department gets it and puts together this arty cover. He says, well, let me get some fancy psychedelic font for yesterday and today, and we're going to make it look like it's, printed on canvas and it's a work of art. He's all excited about it. Of course, when the sales department sees it, they freak out. They run to Alan and they say, look, we can't put this out. Alan once again talks to Brian. Brian insists on it. And Alan says, look, just print up a couple and we'll see what kind of response it gets. And of course, the production department's thinking, you can't print a couple, so damn the torpedoes, full speed ahead. This is a new cover. And of course, when reviewers do see it and distributors see it and stores see it, it becomes as the British would say, a bloody mess, pun intended, and they have to recall the cover. And so then, it's going back now to the butcher cover. Now, what do we have? Well, we've got that trunk image. And so what George Osaki does is he says, well, I like that psychedelic font. So I'm going to combine the psychedelic font from the butcher cover with the idea of the white background trunk cover, and I'll combine it, and I can do that super, super fast. And he does. And they start making the new slicks and for the trunk cover. So the order is trunk, butcher, trunk. That's the short story.
Okay.
Ken, what did 6-year-old Ken think when the first time? Well, okay, let me ask you, when did you first see a picture of the butcher cover?
I didn't even see a picture until the 70s. I wasn't even
okay
at the time.
Okay.
New
So,
Orleans, we didn't see it. No.
You didn't?
No, I didn't. It wasn't like there was one market where, one of the radio stations put it on their survey, but that didn't happen in New Orleans. I was blissfully unaware of the butcher cover. Of course, I was at camp at the time anyway, but I talked to other people in New Orleans, and we didn't find out about it too much later.
Yeah, we being right outside of New York, I did see it in the papers there. When the whole quote unquote scandal over the butcher cover broke out. The tabloids, the New York tabloids, of course, printed it, and it didn't really impact me that much, to be honest.
Black and white, though, didn't you?
Yeah, exactly.
But you didn't see it in any record stores where you were?
No, No, by the time I saw any copies of Yesterday and Today, it was the trunk cover.
Right.
I really didn't get into that many record stores because the situation was, well, first of all, Wallace is in LA, which, one of the co-founders of Capitol owned, obviously they would get things early. So they actually had it. But for the most part, where it got into was things like Sears and other places where you would have, a rack jobber putting it out, because Capitol had their own distributing system. And so Capitol would distribute to the record stores per se. Capitol stopped it. But what happened was you had these other independent people that had the records, and they were putting it in drugstores and department stores and the like. And, they didn't get the word right away. And then when the word came out, Capitol literally was sending employees to department stores and pulling them off the shelves and getting them out. So you know, and some of the fan recollections, I have one fan recollection where he said he was there and a guy from Capitol was like literally boxing him up and taking him away when he wanted to buy the album. So,
Uh-huh. There was also one fan that went to a store, and he noticed cutouts or albums that where the albums were punched, they punched holes in it.
Right.
He got 3 copies
what
of
happened
Butcher
there,
Cover, and they were $1 each.
yeah, what happened there was when you got to late 1966 and early 67, Capitol decided they were going to phase out mono, and it became more
Right.
complete
Yeah.
for later 67. They did put Magical Mystery Tour out in mono, but not in many numbers, and most of those ended up being sent to South America. So what you had was at the point where Capitol is no longer servicing mono, so they made them cutouts. So you could go to a cutout bin and, you know, this guy happens to go in and they got 3 mono copies of Yesterday and Today, and they happen to be mono paste overs. Talk about hitting the jackpot.
Yeah. Huh. Now you say in your book that the Butcher Cover cost Capitol $250,000 to recall, repackage, and redistribute the album.
About $1.5 million today.
Yeah.
With today's inflation, closer to 2 million, maybe.
Mm.
Now, didn't that have a direct impact on its performance on the charts? Wasn't there a week or so when, because these albums were recalled, that maybe you couldn't buy the album that well, or there were just the no, I was wondering if maybe that made the album slip down the charts or just didn't perform well for a while.
I think it delayed its entry into the charts,
Right.
but that's about it. And then the other thing that actually hurt Yesterday and Today's sales, although it still sold extremely well, was the introduction into the market of Revolver. So, you know, let's say if Revolver had come out a few months later, Yesterday and Today would have sold more copies. I think that's a given.
Yeah. Okay. So you do mention for people who want to learn about the Butcher Cover that there was a first state butcher, a second state butcher, or paste over butcher, a third state butcher, or of butcher peel. And you also say of the initial 750,000 run of the album, mono copies were pressed at a ratio of approximately 5-1 over the stereo.
Yeah.
Therefore, a stereo second or third state butcher should be at least 5 times scarcer than a mono butcher.
Yeah, they're going to be rarer. There's no doubt the stereo is much, much rarer on the Butcher Cover, and particularly what we call a first state, which is, you know, as you would have seen it in the record store. And the reason that the stereo first states are so rare is that the mono album, when promo copies were sent to radio stations and reviewers, they always sent out mono copies because radio stations, there wasn't much in the way of FM playing stereo in those days, and AM stereo didn't exist. So you were in a situation where all the review copies were mono. And so the copies that got out were mono, and the stereo ones, for the most part, didn't get out. So that's why they're so rare in their pure, pristine form. And then as far as paste overs, they're rarer simply because Capitol manufactured more monos. So that's why they're rarer.
What would be the value today of a stereo first state?
15 to 20,000 if it's a near mint.
Okay.
And if it's what we call a Livingston Butcher, you know, 125,000 or more. Maybe a stereo one might go for 150.
Yeah.
There are only 4 known copies of Livingston Butcher stereos.
And
By Livingston Butcher, we mean Alan Livingston got a box. Well, the story was an employee, right when this thing is finally over, walks into his office with a box that had, I think it was about 20 mono and 4 stereo. And he says, Alan, take these. And Alan says, that's the last thing in the world I ever want to look at. Get them out there. He says, Alan, these are going to be collector's items. Take them home. Trust me. So Alan takes them and he sticks them in his closet. And decades later, you know, like, you know, in I guess the 80s or whatever, his son goes to a Beatles convention in LA with a couple of those, you know, Butcher covers in the shrink, and, you know, and boy begins to realize, hey, I got something here. And Dad, it would help if you wrote a letter saying that, what this is. So Alan writes a letter and he gets it notarized, and, and these become, which, the highest pedigree of it. And the reason is, first of all, they're in pristine condition. And secondly, they're from the collection of the president of Capitol Records.
Sure.
So that's why they go for so much money.
And that was
I interviewed Alan Livingston,
right? That was at Beatle Fest, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was. It's a Beatle Fest in LA.
Yeah. And as a matter of fact, just curious, at the first Beatle Fest in New York in 1974, there were copies that were going for $500.
Yeah.
So what would those have been? Do you recall?
Those probably would just be, first dates, could be.
Okay.
But, what happened with the Alan Livingston thing, I interviewed Alan Livingston in about 2000. And I said, Alan, do you have any butcher covers left? And he says, I have one mono in my closet. Would you like to see it? Yeah, I look at it, really nice. He says, that must be worth at least $500 or so now. And I said, Alan, I would love to buy it from you right now for $500, but I would be taking advantage of you, and I cannot in clear conscience do so. He says, it's worth more than that? I said, Alan, that could be worth $5,000 to $10,000. Really? I said, yeah. I said, but if you want to sell it to me for $500 with that knowledge, I'll be happy to do so. He said, nah, I think I'll hold on to it,
Okay. All right, let's talk a little bit about, well, the articles that you wrote, Al.
Mm-hmm.
There's one called The Beatles' Rendezvous with Greatness as 1965 spins into 1966. And what you managed to do very effectively there is to talk about everything else going on in the world at that time outside of the Beatles, especially quite a lot on the space program. But
well, that's easy because both Bruce and I were, especially at that time, were both space freaks. And so, yeah. And so it was very easy to kind of frame the piece around the space program, especially the Gemini program, which was pretty much at its height at that point.
And the thing too was, and you think about it, when Al and I were talking about the piece, we came up with the concept of tying it in with Rendezvous, because at that time, Gemini had this Rendezvous, and at that time the Beatles put out, they're like Gemini in the sense they put out a great single and a great album. Yeah. And so, the idea was, okay, Beatles Rendezvous with Greatness, and the world spins, and oh yeah, okay, boom, done. And that was, the concept we came out with. And there's, okay, Al, that's the concept, you write it, and of course, Al writes it, then he gets it back to me, and then I come in and come up with images to make it work well with what Al's written. So it's great working with Al on these chapters, because we bounce off some ideas, get a concept, and Al writes it, I edit it, and I throw in pictures, and at the end of the day, we come up with something that's fun to put together, and we hope the readers enjoy it.
Absolutely.
Yeah. You've got the first generation fans who are going to read that and remember all the things that were going on at the same time. It's really
right
in their memory. And for new fans that want to know what happened back then, it's interesting that you talked about Batman on television replacing Shindig, because also there was another program, was it Frank Daniels that wrote about it, that replaced Hullabaloo? And what was it about these shows? Why didn't the music programs other than American Bandstand survive during that time?
I think it was mainly because, especially in the case of Shindig, because Shindig was it's still probably the best showcase for rock and roll that has ever been on TV. But that was the first season, the 64-65 season. The problem was that over that summer of 65 and in the fall, the network began taking control, because the ratings for Shindig were never very, very high. They were mediocre at best. But because of the fact that the audience was young people, they could sell lots of Clearasil and milk and other stuff to them. So, but by the second season, the network was taking more of a role more control. Jack Good, who the English TV producer, who had an incredible resume in England.
Sure.
He quit because of the interference of the ABC network people. And then they decided, well, Hullabaloo has like a guest star hosting every week, and it's not always a music person. And so they started having people like Ed Wynn and Zsa Zsa Gabor, like guest hosting episodes of Shindig, which made absolutely no sense. And they,
Al, and as I was pointing out, though, these were shows that were in network prime time.
yes,
Whereas American Bandstand's on Saturday morning.
right.
And so what you're willing to do on a Saturday morning is different than what you're willing to do in prime time, where you're really you need those ratings at that time to, get the sponsors. And so I think that was part of it. And also, Dick Clark had, where the action is. And that was something that
Yes.
kids would get home from school and could watch in the afternoon, whereas at night
Very
they
true.
might be doing homework, and the
Right.
afternoon really wasn't, once again, a real ratings bonanza to begin with. So if we could do a music show and get people to watch it in the afternoon, so that's why those shows fared better with the networks than a primetime show. I think that would be part of it too.
And yet
Mhm.
the Ed Sullivan Show did amazingly well, and they had a
Yeah, but
lot.
the Sullivan Show was different. The
Right.
Sullivan Show was a true variety show. It was not a rock and roll
Exactly.
show.
Mm,
And the
Right.
idea behind the Sullivan Show was it was a show that the entire family on a Sunday night could watch. And often on Sunday night, if you had an extended family where you lived with grandpa, if you were a kid and your grandparents were living in the house, that Sunday night, you would all sit down at the dinner table, and then afterwards you all would watch Ed Sullivan. So you needed something for three different generations.
mm.
And so Sullivan's idea was, we'll have, maybe something from a Broadway play. We might have some classical music on. We might have Le Juggler on, which almost anybody can watch. And for the youngsters, we're going to have rock and roll music, be it Elvis, Buddy Holly, the Beatles, Dave Clark 5 was a big favorite of his,
Mhm.
those types of
Mhm.
things. So Sullivan worked really well for many, many years. And then as people got richer and had more TVs, all of a sudden it was different. In other words, when I was watching the Beatles on the Sullivan Show, my parents had a TV in their bedroom and a TV in the living room. So we were probably rich. We had two TVs in the house. But by the time you get to the 70s and TVs are smaller and cheaper, if you had a teenage son and a teenage daughter, each of them in their own bedroom might have a small little TV. So on Sunday night, they weren't going to be watching Ed Sullivan. They might be watching, one of them might be watching Voyage to the Bottom of the Sea, and the other one might be
Mhm.
watching Disney. And, and so what made the Sullivan Show so great, it was gone because there wasn't a need for three generations to get something that they would like at the same time. And I think that's what killed off the Sullivan Show.
Well, it's so much like that
Absolutely.
now because everything is all about demographics and who you're appealing to, and you want to have a target demo instead of a wide demo, which is what variety
Right.
were. And I sure miss that.
Mhm.
And
No.
just to mention a few of the things that you have in your article besides what we mentioned, of course, the Vietnam War, Star Trek on television, the Monkees replaced Hullabaloo.
Yes.
Sweet Charity on Broadway, and Cold Blood by Truman Capote, that became the best-selling true crime book of all time until Helter Skelter.
Mhm.
The Texas Snipers, Civil Unrest, the Meredith March, the Bobby Kennedy phenomenon, all that going on around this time. All very
Yeah, it was an amazing time. And actually that period isn't even as revolutionary and mind-numbing as, say, 1968. Having done a few of these and kind of taking the change in times
Hmm.
format in a sense to these. The 66 was maybe a little less revolutionary than some of the other time periods we've gone into.
Oh, yeah.
Courtesy of NASA, we made it a very visual chapter.
Yes, absolutely.
There was one thing here I wasn't even aware of. A minor controversy. Pittsburgh disc jockey broadcast an alleged telephone interview in which the Beatles put down Sergeant Barry Sadler's song, "The Ballad of the Green Beret," as rubbish.
Mhm.
This was looked as an attack on the Special Operations Force of the U.S. Army in Vietnam instead of just not liking the song. And there were fans that threatened to boycott stores that carried Beatles music. Obviously I knew about the Beatles being bigger than Jesus controversy, but I wasn't aware of this one.
This is kind of a
Yeah.
strange thing because it got coverage in one of the UK music magazines, but didn't get coverage in Billboard, Cashbox, or Record World.
Huh.
So, and it was one of those things that I think, if you were British and you were in the States reporting on something going on, it caught your attention of this is kind of interesting. Whereas in the US, it wasn't like the Jesus thing that was soon to come.
Right.
So it was a controversy that wasn't reported as a controversy in the UK. It's kind of interesting.
All right. You also say that there were Beatles breakup rumors starting in America as early as November of 66.
Yep, exactly. There were, in fact, there was a record store freebie called Go Magazine that I remember in New York, WMCA kind of, it was kind of rubber stamped in different radio stations around the country. In New York, it was WMCA, and there was a piece that ran in the centerfold of a particular issue in the middle of November that was saying that there's not going to be a new Beatles album for Christmas. And they've, all but announced that they're not going to make any personal appearances anymore, and they're all doing different things. So it looks like the Beatles are breaking up. And there were rumors about that. Also, there were in November of '66 in England, there was this the little rumor about a traffic accident that Paul McCartney had been involved in, which of course was a very minor little accident in comparison to what emerged 3 years later. But between that and these rumors about them breaking up, you've probably seen the film. I think it's in the anthology, if I'm not mistaken, of the four of them arriving at EMI when they were just beginning the sessions for what became Sgt. Pepper, and they're all being asked, "Is the group breaking up?"
That's right.
That's a very persistent rumor in the UK, and Brian was constantly denying it. No, they're just doing some separate things, but they're getting back together and to record a single real soon.
Yeah.
I guess when there's a lapse of time without a new album, people were getting,
well, especially in those days, because of the fact that there were very small periods of time when there wasn't a new Beatles single or a new Beatles album.
Particularly in the US. I mean, look, Brian's goal in the UK was 2 albums and 4 singles a year. In the US, at times it seemed like 3 albums a year and 4 or 5 singles a year, 6 singles a year, whatever. So you were in that mode. So, all of a sudden, how come there's no new Beatles product? I mean, George Martin at one point recognized, well, in the US, for some reason, they need more singles than here. Well, as Capitol just wanted to keep the Beatles in the public eye constantly, because Capitol was worried if they weren't, they were going to be, they weren't going to be as fab or popular anymore. Some new fab would come in and take their place. So that was why you have these things just rushed out at such crazy things. The other thing that I think bears talking about Rubber Soul that we didn't quite cover. And that was that you have Paul talking to the Beatles Monthly magazine, and he tells the editor, yeah, we just got back from the US, they want a new album out by Christmas and the cupboard's bare. So they, in an extremely short period of time, had to write and record 16 songs, 14 for an album and 2 for a single. And under that time pressure, look at the quality of the 16 songs they put out.
Yeah.
Out of those 16 songs, 8 of them appear on the, hits album that came out in 73, by far the most from any session, not even close. So that gives you an idea of under the gun of we need to knock out an album and the pressure. And Paul is saying the cupboard's bare. I mean, yeah, he did resurrect Michelle from a while back, but I mean, essentially the cupboard's bare and they're coming from scratch and they put out those 16 songs. I mean, that's just remarkable.
Yeah.
And just by way of comparison, when they began the Get Back sessions, it was a similar thing where aside from a few things that Paul had going, and some of the newer things that that George had come up with, the cupboard was pretty bare there. And I think if you by comparison, if you look at what they turned out for the Get Back sessions and what they turned out for Rubber Soul in a much shorter period of time, there's no comparison.
I think, when people ask me about what is it about Rubber Soul, it's, well, the songs. It's just so great.
Yeah, exactly.
Where do those songs come from? I mean, and I'll give you a funny little story. I have a niece who has a son who's about, I guess he might be like maybe 8 years old or whatever. And I hadn't seen him in a long time. And, then he was a lot younger. And he says, my mom tells me that you know a lot about the space program. And last summer I went to space camp and we talk about space camp. He says, but what I really want to talk to you about is the Beatles. Mom says you've written some books on the Beatles. And I said, yeah, I have. And I said, well, young man, what's your favorite Beatles song? He goes, In My Life, of course. And I'm like, whoa, wait.
Whoa.
His favorite Beatles song is an album track from Rubber Soul. That to me blew me away.
Absolutely.
And he asked me, well, Uncle Bruce, what are your favorite Beatles songs? And I said, my favorite mega hit, Hey Jude. My favorite album track, In My Life. My favorite obscure Beatles song, if there is such a thing, Across the Universe. Oh yeah, those are really good choices. I mean, this is like a little kid.
Yeah.
So that just amazes me, how brilliant the songs from Rubber Soul are, even today.
No question.
I've often said that Rubber Soul is one of the greatest miracles in Beatle history when you consider the fact that the recording sessions didn't start until October 12th.
Yeah.
They had to have the album ready by early December and have the photo shoot. Plus, like you said, the single, apart from the 14 songs, they still brought back, What Goes On. What Goes On was an older song there. And they brought back Wait from the Help sessions. But even still, it's a lot of material in a very short period of time.
Yeah, especially since they had to leave for a British tour, basically in 2 or 3 weeks. So you're talking even a shorter amount of time than there was for the Get Back sessions.
And they still have to, they have to press those records and all kind of other things to get them into store. I mean,
exactly.
It was just mind-boggling, they could do that.
There is one thing I want to say about what you just mentioned about the songs that made 1962 to 66. And yes, it's tremendous that there's so many songs from Rubber Soul, but they really shortchange Revolver. I mean, you only have Yellow Submarine and Eleanor Rigby on there. So, if that collection is supposed to be an indication of their best material, it's debatable. I mean, it's all great stuff. But, with all the heaps of praise given to Revolver, especially in the recent decades, you would think that there would be more from that album.
I mean, you certainly could have put Here, There, and Everywhere on it and Good Day Sunshine, and nobody would have said, what are those 2 songs doing on it?
Yeah.
Got to Get You Into My Life, certainly.
Right. Yeah. tomorrow never knows.
I mean, they had paperback writer Rain, which are considered, from at least from the Revolver sessions, they did
Yeah.
have paperback writers. So
True. Okay, your other article, Al, called "A Song for Every Purpose Under Heaven." Of course, we know where that's from.
Right.
1965. You said was the year of high tide for the British invasion, the birth of folk rock, and God bless you, Al, Herb Alpert and the Tijuana Brass. And I was a major fan.
Absolutely, mate. That was the era of musical versatility. Where on the radio, if you turned on, any top 40 station in any market in the country, you might hear something by the Beatles, and then something by Frank Sinatra, and then something by Roger Miller, and then something by James Brown, and then something by the Rolling Stones, et cetera, et cetera. And Bruce had to put a major choke chain on me, or else he would have gotten 200 pages, just because I still consider 1965 to be the greatest year in the history of rock and roll, and 66 is a close second. So
it's fun. It's fun,
Yes.
when and Al turns it in and I'm looking at things, and and then of course we need to find the appropriate album covers and picture sleeves to go with it. And then sometimes I'll say, now, Al, you did leave out one of my favorites. We gotta put in this song, gotta have Working in a Coal Mine by Lee Dorsey, or
Absolutely.
we got, and things like, so, it's just great because, as Al said, if I let him loose, I mean, Al like sometimes go, well, Bruce, it's kind of long, fine. I've always been able to make it work, and it's just fun working with Al. It's been a true pleasure. I have a good team of people working on these books. Frank Daniels has been great to work with.
Yep.
Bill King, Piers up in Canada has been great. And then, other people that'll contribute a piece that's just more than your typical thing. And we're going to have to make this a chapter. I've done that with Jude before. In this case, David Leaf comes up with something and you're like, oh my God, this, that can't be a one-page fan recollection. That needs to be a separate standalone chapter. So I've been very fortunate to get people like Al and others to contribute to the books. And it's fun editing it and working with all of these fabulous people.
Yeah, they all add so much to the book. And, I just wanted to bring up the fact that, Al, who I've interviewed so many times, but on this channel, one of my earliest interviews, we're lamenting about radio and the state of radio.
Yeah.
It used to be like, and, my music taste come from a large part from the Beatles, but from being brought up on top 40 radio, which was had so much variety in the 60s and in the 70s too. And, the fact that you can have bubblegum, pop, hard rock, R&B, country, novelty records. And like you said, Frank Sinatra, you can't find on the hit oriented stations of today, what they call contemporary hit radio. You can't find artists who are in their 50s or 60s having hit records unless they're teaming up with somebody young, for the most part. But those were terrific times. And, just right in the middle of the first half of 1964, when the Beatles were invading America, there's Hello, Dolly at number one.
Exactly.
Armstrong. And, it's just proof of how great things were back then. And, I love the fact that it was a tremendous influence on the young people who were listening to radio then, who were exposed to all these different styles of music. And I truly miss that, more than anything. Those are my favorite memories of radio. And not just the 60s, but there's so much great stuff that came out of the 70s too.
Sure.
But I'm rambling on here
question.
like I expected to on radio. But Frank Daniels did a great article, mainly on the movies of the time and the TV shows of the time. And I do love what Jude Kessler wrote, that the release of Rubber Soul at Christmas time 1965 was the one stability in a world shifting all around me. Bill King's article was really strong for a couple of pages. It kind of surprised me how he opened by saying that Sergeant Pepper caught almost no one by surprise.
And just depends on your orientation. If your
Yeah.
orientation was, boy, Rubber Soul, this is really different, and then Revolver is really different, you're kind of expecting the next one to be really different. And so I think in Bill's case, he was aware of the trajectory. Not everybody was.
Yeah.
And so the guy, it doesn't shock me that someone who was aware of that trajectory one day becomes editor of something called Beatle Fan Magazine.
Right.
Sure. And especially after the appetizer of Penny Lane and Strawberry Fields, you just knew that the next thing was going to be spectacular and it was going to be very different, which made the wait for it, just agonizing. And so I've talked about that millions of times, but I mean, it was that period just from February until the beginning of June was long enough, but also it had been 10 months between Revolver and Sergeant Pepper, which was an eternity.
Yeah.
I'd give anything if Paul McCartney put out a new album every 10 months now.
Oh yeah. Now it's 6 years between albums for major artists.
Oh, that's true.
Adele went for 6 years between her most recent album and the one that came out last year.
Don't even talk about Stevie Wonder.
Oh, yeah.
Stevie Wonder takes forever, but
yes,
he's well worth it to me. I love what David Leaf had to say about him loving the American Rubber Soul album more than the UK one, and he related how Pet Sounds was influenced by the American Rubber Soul. He wrote with its acoustic folk rock vibe, and it challenged Brian Wilson, and inspired him to create an album with similar sonic consistency. He said, if Rubber Soul had started with Drive My Car instead of I've Just Seen a Face, it might not have had the same effect on Brian.
Yeah, and I think that's a very valid point.
Absolutely.
And I get asked by people, well, Bruce, which one is better or this? And I just tell people, look, it's like someone asking you to compare a great red wine to a great white wine. You really can't. Right. They both have their own subtleties, and they're both brilliant in their own way. And that's kind of the way I view the two albums. What do I listen to more? Probably the American one more, but it doesn't mean I think that it's vastly superior. I think they're different, and I think I stick to my statement. And it's like comparing a great red wine to a great white wine. You can't do it. They're both brilliant in their own way, and they both deserve a release in a catalog, is the way I view it.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
It's a listening experience.
Yeah. Let me briefly mention a collection of Beatles oldies, which I'm glad that you included in there, since it came out at the end of 1966. You said that, we know it didn't perform that well on the British album charts.
Yeah, that had to be a shock for EMI.
And yet, greatest hits compilations at that time from the Beach Boys and the Rolling Stones sold better. Yep. Why do you suppose that was? This is the biggest band in the world,
I think a lot of it was people already had those singles.
Yeah.
And it was like, I'm going to buy this album. What's new on it? Oh, well, Bad Boy, a Larry Williams song. Do I really want to spend, 2 to 3 pounds for that? I don't know, So I think that might have been part of it. People already had it.
And I guess
back then you weren't buying it necessarily. So, I need to buy the album because I want to hear these songs in stereo, because in the UK stereo wasn't that big in 66.
Okay. I'm used to the mentality of, after a few years, you got to have a greatest hits album no matter what, and a lot of people were saying, even though we had the red and blue collections in 73, we needed one.
Yeah.
The year 2000, there's got to be something for the new Beatle fan out there. So there's always a need for a greatest hits, and considering how many hits the Beatles had up to that point, it was staggering. They certainly warranted a greatest hits album at that time, I think.
surprising that Capitol didn't put it out. That always surprised me, why didn't Capitol put it out in the States?
Yeah, because the contract that was in effect at that point did not have any stipulation about, there not being a greatest hits album.
They could have put out their own, a collection of 12 oldies rather than 16,
Yes.
That is quite shocking. They wanted, sure, they wanted to make more money off the Beatles. That would have been easy for the Christmas market to do that.
Yeah.
I just wanted to ask about, you say, well, I want to know where you got this from, actually. Neil Aspinall had said that Paul made a home demo of What Goes On, which he gave to Ringo so that he could hear how the song sounded. I hadn't heard that before, that there was a demo for that. I was aware of there's an early demo that sold a few years ago of John doing it. Where did you hear about that?
I probably got that from one of the British music magazines, which is where most of the information I have would have been from that.
All right. And I've always known that John contributed a line for Taxman, and you have the line in here. Now, my advice for those who died, declare the pennies on your eyes. Just want to know what the source was for that. You remember?
I don't recall off the top of my head now.
Hey,
I think it was an interview with John, but I don't remember which interview.
Okay. Since I'm going to be doing a lot of talking about Revolver on all my podcasts here, and I just did a show with Alan and Darren about it, at least on the outtakes. Would you happen to know about Love You Too? That introduction of the song, if that was something that George wrote, because have you heard the box set yet?
I mean, I've heard the box set, and it was something that apparently George was playing, and then it was recorded, and then that was put on the front of the song. So it was an edit piece to the front of the song. It wasn't that he sat down and played that as part of the song. So
Okay.
it could have been a case of him just warming up and tuning and just playing it. And it may have been something he heard before or that he worked on with Ravi Shankar. It may have been something he just wrote on his own or just hit him and he sat down and played it. But the notes make it clear that George played the sitar. People had said before, but the sitar playing on this was so much better in advanced than what you heard on Norwegian Wood that it clearly couldn't have been George. It had to have been, one of these professional musicians, but that wasn't the case. And the guy who played tabla on it, guy was a music student. So he wasn't really a professional musician, as it turns out. So that was kind of interesting to learn from Kevin Howitt's notes in the book.
Okay.
So, I found that fascinating. The other thing about Love You Too is that Paul is playing tempura on it. So he's playing that drone instrument sound. So you actually have two Beatles playing Indian instruments on that song with, the drum type instrument being played by an actual student of Indian music, which I found interesting. And of course, George, has on there, it starts out where he's playing it on acoustic guitar and singing along.
Yep.
So it's a very interesting track. And what I love about these box sets is you gain more appreciation of the Beatles music, but particularly George. I think when you listen to these box sets on every single one of them, it's, oh, wait a minute. George is really a lot better and more important than I thought he was. You get more of an appreciation for George. At least in my case, I find that to be on Within You, Without You. From the very beginning when they began doing these series, you realize George was a really powerful member of the Beatles.
No question.
Oh, yeah. That's one of the things in listening to the remix of Revolver. There's a lot more guitar playing from George as a lead guitarist, not necessarily playing a lead solo. There's parts there that you may not have paid that careful attention to before. So a lot of work that was put into those songs. And the amazing thing is how quickly it was all done anyway. How they came up with what they played so fast.
And then Paul's, of course, his lead playing on, he's playing the Casino on Paperback Writer. He's playing the Casino on Rain. He's playing the guitar solo on Taxman, and some really great guitar work by Paul on Revolver as well. So, I mean, it's,
Yeah.
incredible. And then, of course, if we're going to talk about outtakes, we have to talk about Yellow Submarine,
Mhm.
which,
Yes.
and what I find so fascinating about it, and by the time this airs, people will have heard it, um, is, on this work tape, John comes on with this, plaintive type thing of, in the place where I was born, no one cared, no one cared.
Mm.
And he's got that. And Paul, in the meantime, I've got this catchy little thing. We all live in a yellow submarine. And, and what we don't know is, did John and Paul sit down and write the first two verses? Did Paul have more than we all live in a yellow submarine or not? Because, the first two verses open up with, in the town where I was born.
Right.
And the fascinating thing when you listen to the work tape on it, when they're ready to do, this combined song, Paul says, John, well, you go ahead and sing it. And John's, well, John really wanted Paul to sing. And Paul says, well, you know how it should be sung because it's John's melody.
Hmm.
And then he says, can you read this? And I'm assuming he's pointing to handwritten lyrics that Paul has written. Now, did Paul come to the session with that? Or more likely, I think, Paul and John are talking and Paul's writing down these ideas as John and Paul are doing it. And so they've got two verses of Yellow Submarine only. They don't have a third verse. Paul, with help from Donovan, writes the third verse later on.
Mm.
Yeah.
So it's fascinating to see how that happens. Got to Get You Into My Life. My God, we've got, fortunately, the
Yeah.
replay from Anthology, but what we've got that's new by sheer luck is they saved a mono mix before the horns come on. And so, yeah, we read about the fact that there were these fuzz guitars. Well, now we hear the fuzz guitars. Well, what are the fuzz guitars playing? What was later on going to be recorded over, but it's the brass horn riffs. Da 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 da. There it is. And that's the missing link. I mean, that to me was fascinating.
Yeah. We just talked about this on Things We Said Today. And actually what the guitars are playing, it sounds kind of like the riff for Paperback Writer. A little bit to me in my ear. So yeah, to me that was my favorite moment. That other take of Got to Get You Into My Life.
And did you notice on Dr. Robert, I'd read in Lewison's book, it's edited down. Well, I didn't know. I thought maybe they had a jam at the end and they edited it down. But what we find out is that on Dr. Robert, on the best performance they do, take 7, John and the group screw up and they do the middle 8 3 times rather than 2. The well part is done 3 times. And John realizes it, and they have an image of the tape box in the book. And on the tape box, it's actually written something to the effect of, and take, when editing, that it has 3/8 cut out. Well, 3/8 means the third middle 8 edited out. And that's actually written on the tape box. And when they do the edit or the mix, they do edit that out. And you only get the well 2 times. So that mystery's solved. A lot of mysteries solved by this box set.
Yeah. I can't wait till I get it. I just have the audio right now. I haven't seen the booklet yet or read the booklet.
It's once again, a wonderful job on the booklet and the book there. I think they're giving Kevin more freedom to really go out and get more technical than a lot of people want. But for us, it's great.
Absolutely. No
Yeah,
question.
Yeah, apparently we now know that it was Paul that played bass on She Said, She Said.
Oh yeah, absolutely. It sounded like Paul, but what we know now is we know that there's a take that has drums, 2 guitars and bass played simultaneously.
Right.
Well, when you listen to that bass part, we know it isn't George. And, it's not a case of Paul's on the casino and George is on bass. Clearly it's Paul on bass. But then when you listen to the backing vocals, it's only John and George, which means they did have the fight and Paul walked out after the music was recorded, but before the vocals were recorded. So that's where the fight happens.
Yeah, I remember talking to Jerry Hammond about that, and he said the same thing. Since the bass and drums were recorded on the same track, they'd have to redo the whole thing over. So, for expediency, it made more sense to just keep it, really.
Why wouldn't you keep it? It's a brilliant bass part by Paul.
Yeah.
Paul walked out, so what? We're going to keep the musical backing. We ain't changing that.
All right, I just wanted to get your thoughts on one thing here. This is something sort of controversial. You know, for many years now, Paul has said that he wrote the melody for In My Life. And if you follow, you know, the whole history of Lennon and McCartney, there was never a time when one guy wrote the lyrics and one wrote the melody.
Right.
They all wrote everything together, whether, you know, in pieces in their songs. But it seemed like, you know, that's the only time I've ever heard anything like that ever happening. And there are some people out there that have done studies that really know, that have analyzed McCartney melodies versus Lennon melodies.
Oh.
Some of them have said, well, you know, this is closer to a McCartney melody or something. I don't ever want to doubt what the Beatles have to say, because nobody should know their songwriting better than they do, although they have contradicted each other a few times.
Yeah.
But
Done in my life.
your thoughts on that?
Yeah.
I mean, look, to me, it's conceivable John could have written that melody. If you look at his original lyrics, those original lyrics don't work with that melody. So it's possible that, you know, Paul could have contributed to it and John, you know, cleans it up and finishes it. So is it possible? Yeah. I mean, I think either one's possible. We're never going to know unless there's a demo work tape that comes out in the Revolver box set where John and Paul are talking about it. And John says, oh, I've rewritten the words to this song. And, you know, rather than making it naming all these places in Liverpool, I'm making it more generic. And Paul says, yeah, you know, I've got this great, you know, bit that I think will go well with it. Then that answer will be solved. Short of that, you know, we probably will never know. I mean, far be it for me to say John was lying then or Paul is lying now.
Right.
I don't know.
I always want to give the Beatles the benefit of the doubt, because, you know, there's only two people that were in the room when they wrote their songs together, or sometimes one.
Yeah, but
know?
they're disagreeing now. John's saying, you know, melody, lyrics, everything's mine. And Paul is saying, oh yeah, I contributed to the melody on that one. So
He might have contributed the middle eight.
yeah,
Hmm.
you know, one never knows on that
Yeah.
one.
Hmm.
But you know, regardless, I think we can all agree it's one of the Beatles' best songs ever.
Oh, no question.
Definitely. So let's just talk a bit about Revolver. And as I've mentioned on my shows quite frequently, you know, growing up and looking at surveys through the years, Rolling Stones, top 100 albums of all time, it's always been Sgt. Pepper. Ever since I can remember, you know, it's the greatest Beatles album. It's the greatest album of all time. And I think my personal opinion, ever since the Beatles albums came out on CD in 1987, and Americans suddenly, if they hadn't already, discovered the British albums, they realized how different the British Revolver album was, with 3 more Lennon songs and everything. But also hearing the songs in that chronology with those albums. And there's such a stark contrast between Rubber Soul and Revolver. Nowadays, there's so many people looking at Revolver as the Beatles' best album. So I want to know what your thoughts are on that. It's all a question of opinion, obviously, from all of us. But what do you think accounts for this change? Although I should also say that I'm thinking it from an American perspective, because in the UK, they didn't have that problem. I mean, they thought very highly, they praised very highly of Revolver. But, you know, growing up and always seeing Sgt. Pepper is it. That was the album that changed everything. Why do you suppose there's been this shift in attitude and in perception of Revolver? And do you think it is their best work?
Well, look, the way I always answer this question, I'll go first and then let Al get it wrong. No, I'm kidding. You know, when Sgt. Pepper came out, I gave a presentation on Sgt. Pepper. And I said, is Sgt. Pepper the Beatles' best album? And I said, no, it's not their best album. And if push comes to shove, I would probably say Revolver is their best album. Does Sgt. Pepper have the Beatles' best songs? No. If push came to shove, I would say Rubber Soul has the best songs. If someone said, is Sgt. Pepper the Beatles' best sounding album? After all, it won a Grammy for engineering. I would say no. Abbey Road is probably their best overall sounding album.
Mhm.
And if someone asked me, what is your favorite Beatles album without missing a heartbeat, I'd say the White Album is my favorite album. So what is Sgt. Pepper? It's the Beatles' most important album because it was the one that elevated rock music to an art form. And as I say, this wasn't art for art's sake. This was a brilliant album on its own. So, but if you take it song by song, it's not their strongest collection of songs. They work well together. A Day in the Life is up there with anything they've done. Maybe if Penny Lane and Strawberry Fields Forever are on Sgt. Pepper, then it is their best album. But without those two songs, I don't think it's their best, but it's by far their most important. And if you ask people, what do you think their favorite Beatles album or their best Beatles album is? Pepper may not be number one for everybody on those two different questions, but it'll be in their top 2 or 3 for sure. So that's where I put it. But I do think the British Revolver, to me, I would put as their best overall album. Not my favorite, but the best.
Okay. Best and favorite could always be different.
Absolutely.
No question. Yeah. Echoing what Bruce said about Sgt. Pepper, it is definitely not the Beatles' best album. And I've always said that it is their most important album because it was a game changer, coming out just at the point where FM radio was beginning to take on rock music, coming at the beginning of the Summer of Love, and all the timing was absolutely perfect for an album like that. But it is not their best album. It is their most important. As far as Revolver, I think possibly what may have happened is that it kind of, in a sense, got lost in the shuffle because
overshadowed by Pepper.
Yeah, exactly. It was very much overshadowed. Plus the fact that when it came out in August of '66, it was right in the middle of the whole Jesus kerfuffle, plus the tour on which the Beatles performed not one note from their newest album. I think it did get kind of lost in the shuffle. And it wasn't until the 70s and 80s that I think people, especially as Ken mentioned, the 1987, 88 CDs, when a lot of people probably heard the British album, maybe for the first time, and realized what a brilliant piece of, for that time, just what a brilliant piece it is. And it's, although again, as Bruce said, it's not my favorite Beatles album. That would be either Rubber Soul, the White Album, or Abbey Road. But I think it is, in terms of sonically, as you say, the collection of songs, just the songs alone. It's I think it's probably their greatest accomplishment, if you want to put it that way, on record. It was the first album on which they were able to really take some time and stretch out and really use the studio as an instrument on its own, which
I agree with that.
Which they which they didn't have the time to do with any of the earlier albums, because they were, in 2 weeks we have to be out on a British tour, or we're making we're making a movie, or we're whatever. It's this was the first time, and it was because of the fact that they didn't have a third movie to do, that they had a couple of months to really spend in the studio. So I think
Just say
that's,
didn't do a talent for loving.
yes. Or Lord of the Rings.
Oh, yeah.
Well, there's no doubt about it. Revolver to me is a stunning album, and
Yeah.
it really, my impression of it has changed so much over the years. I always loved it, but
Mhm.
now when you listen in contrast to Rubber Soul, I mean, that's what impresses me so much, that they spread themselves out so well and did so much in terms of expanding themselves, the different genres of music that they all tackled and did so well. It isn't just the fact that George Harrison wrote an Indian song. It's a really
Mhm.
good Indian song, and it was
Right.
executed well. We all know Paul can write the greatest love songs, and Here, There, and Everywhere is one of the greatest ones. You got psychedelic music with, She Said, Tomorrow Never
Mhm.
Knows, I'm Only Sleeping. You got George really stepping up with 3 songs of his own. You got a great children's song with Yellow Submarine. You got, Good Day Sunshine in there, and the classical influence songs like For No One and Eleanor Rigby. I mean, I still can't understand how George Harrison could say Revolver was, like Rubber Soul Part 2. It's not as layered and produced
Mhm.
as Sgt. Pepper is. They're still closer to being a band and just stripped down to being a band in that regard. But when you talk about all the different styles of music that they did so well on it, it's like 2 different bands.
I
I
think
think
what, go on now.
I think I think the 2 albums were so close together chronologically in terms of the recording of them. Perhaps that's one. And plus, okay, let's say that George had some, shall we say, chemical or maybe even natural distractions around that time that
Mhm.
might contribute to that. But one thing, though, you know whose album that is? Revolver is Ringo's album. His work on that album is absolutely brilliant.
Mm.
Yeah, I mean, and we can talk about that real in a second. We'll get back to that. But in following
Yeah.
up in George's logic, that Rubber Soul is really the first time, look, the other albums, they're recording songs because we need to get songs out for an album. Hard Day's Night, we're recording songs for a movie. Help, we're recording songs for a movie, and we're going to throw some other songs together. Rubber Soul,
That,
we're going to do an album. These
yeah.
tracks are going to be an album. And that
Mhm.
carried on with Revolver. And I think that's what George was saying. We had this
Mm.
concept of we're doing this album and now we're doing it again. So to
Mhm.
pick up Al's point about Ringo's brilliant drumming, obviously it's his brilliant drumming for that session, because we have to
Yes.
talk about Paperback Writer and particularly Rain.
Sure.
Rain is by
Yeah.
far, if you ask Ringo, what is his best drumming? He'll say Rain. And
Mhm.
when I listen to Rain as a single, I'm thinking, wow, this is brilliant. Well, on the box set, we knew they recorded Rain fast and they slowed it down, but we didn't comprehend what the difference between 50 kilocycles a second is and 42 kilocycles a second is until we hear the box set. In
Yeah.
back to back on the box set, we have Rain the way it was recorded at, normal speed, 50 kilocycles a second, followed by Rain slowed down to 42 kilocycles a second for John to lay down his lead vocal.
Mm.
And the difference is amazing. One runs about 2.5 minutes and one's like 3 minutes. So, I mean, it's a significant time difference. And when you hear it, it sounds like we were joking, like, the Ramones doing Rain. And
Mhm.
it's like that. And yet, even at that speed, Ringo doesn't miss a thing. It's
No.
brilliant drumming and it's precise drumming and it's fast.
Yeah.
And I can see why Ringo was so proud of it when I listened to the box set. It was brilliant at any speed, but
Mhm.
particularly fast. And I'm wondering how many Beatle tribute bands, and if you're out there, Liverpool, at the next fest, are you going to have the guts to play Rain at that speed? That's a challenge, boys. Let me hear you do
Yeah.
it.
Well, you realize how good the Beatles were as musicians when you see Beatles tribute bands who can't get it all
Oh.
sound correct. And, a lot of people think Ringo's drumming is so simple, and they never match what he does.
Yeah.
Now, Ringo, and I talked with Denny Sywell about it, who was a jazz session drummer before he played with Paul.
Sure.
And Denny said, I asked Ringo if he was previously a jazz drummer, because Ringo is not just that, four to the floor beat. Ringo doesn't miss a beat, but Ringo also has a little bit of a jazz swing style that's extremely subtle, and most Beatle tribute band drummers miss it. One of the groups that nails it really well, when at full strength Liverpool, but also there's a group called Jukebox out of Puerto Rico, and their drummer Carlos gets Ringo, and you can just hear it. He gets Ringo. Most of them don't. And that's the thing about Ringo. When you see the Love Show, before the Love Show, and you're listening to the music tracks without the vocals, on a stereo system that's almost as good as my home stereo. Yeah, right. You hear what a brilliant drummer Ringo is. And on Revolver, I agree with Al, it's just brilliant drumming, brilliant on Rain, brilliant on Paperback Writer. The only song where Ringo's drumming is a little bit questionable is one of the takes that's not used for And Your Bird Can Sing, where Ringo is bashing and bashing the singles. And as I say in my review of it, which will be available for reading on Beatle.net, my website, is it sounds like a very talented bar band. Whereas the earlier version of And Your Bird Can Sing sounds like the Birds, which is kind of interesting. And then the final version sounds like, the Beatles. But, it's interesting. You have like basically three different versions of And Your Bird Can Sing, three different approaches. And that second one, they sound like a very talented bar band. But Ringo's drumming is stellar throughout that album, and quite frankly, through their entire career.
Oh, no question.
If you're fortunate enough to be able to hear isolated tracks, you'll definitely pick that up. And one of my stepsons is a musician, and he plays the drums, and he's got amazing ears, and he can hear everything on a record. And he's a left-handed drummer too. He's got Ringo's parts nailed down. And sometimes when he's practicing and I only hear the drums of those songs, you realize what great parts Ringo came up with. She Said is amazing for drumming.
Yes.
And, some of the patterns that Ringo's playing were things that, Paul said, hey, play it this way. And Ringo, being, the team player, sat down and played it Paul's way and nailed it. So, Ticket to Ride, Paul, why don't you play it this way? Yeah, it works brilliantly. It works so brilliantly that the Beach Boys copped it and Girl Don't Tell Me, so there's just a lot of great stuff out there. And I cringe anytime somebody says, well, they're not good musicians, or Ringo's the luckiest guy in the world.
Oh, yeah.
Even John said he's not even the best drummer in the band, which John never said.
Never said, right?
Ringo is a great drummer. I had some idiot bass player I knew, and he's telling me, I'm a bass player, and I got to tell you, Paul's bass playing just isn't that good. And I said, yeah, well, when you have, your first million seller, we'll talk.
Yeah.
Just insane stuff when people say that. Or John's rhythm playing is not really that brilliant. Yeah, listen to, All My Loving, or, John's not, that great a guitarist. John played lead guitar in a couple of songs. I mean, come on, folks. These guys were brilliant musicians. And when they were together, they were even better, of course, but they were brilliant musicians. I get sick when people, tell me that they just weren't that good.
Well, once in a while I get to see a Beatles tribute band, and you're very lucky if you get one person in the band that's very good at that Beatle, and that's it.
Yeah.
Well, what I tell people is, it's extremely rare for a Beatles tribute band where they have a guy who can be ballad Paul or rock and roll Paul.
Yeah.
Usually Paul can do, and a tribute band can do one or the other. If he nails Yesterday, don't expect him to, be good on Dizzy, not Dizzy, I mean on, on I'm Down.
I'm Down.
Or Long Tall Sally. If he can sing Long Tall Sally, don't expect him to be able to sing Yesterday.
Yeah.
But the fact that Paul could do both is what makes it hard. And there's certain songs where, particularly the one that hits me the most is where, when I've heard the group, and it's a curse knowing the music the way we do, because unless we're really drunk, we're going to hear every mistake.
Yes.
But there are a lot of the bands where I'd like to walk up to them and say, fellas, overall pretty good, but do not ever do paperback writer again.
So many of those songs
Absolutely.
are difficult to really nail down. It's parts are not as easy as you might think they are.
Yeah.
These guys are just absolutely brilliant, you know.
Yeah. All right, guys, this has been tremendous. Bruce, if people want to order your book, once again, mention your website.
My website is beatle.net. The advantage of buying directly from my website is that I sign the books. If you want them personalized, I personalize them. And we also package the books in bubble wrap and in sturdy boxes. So unlike other people who I won't mention, chances are your book is going to arrive in pristine condition. And the other thing we do for the books is that in the album series, we have these collector's editions, and check those out because they have a lot of great extras. And in the Rubber Soul to Revolver one, the extra that everybody's raving about is it has a poster that shows the 6 different primary variations of the Yesterday and Today album cover. And that is, you know, really cool. So you get posters, bookmarks, sometimes some of the other ones you'll get great stuff from Eric Cash, and it comes in a nice little O case. So if you can swing it, the collector's editions are really cool. They're limited to 500. They're numbered and signed and the whole bit. And do check out beatle.net, folks. And we also have articles and fun things on it. So that's my pitch. And I didn't mention it too much, I hope. And do check it out.
And you can still get your older books, right? As digital copies.
Yeah, you know, the only one that's totally not available through us anywhere is the Apple book. I was starting to do a digital version of it, a revised and expanded one. And then I started doing the album series. And so I'm so focused on the album series, I haven't gotten around to that yet. But if you can't afford in the secondary market, the VJ or the Capital books, the digital editions or PDF files, they look great on an iPad in particular. And,
Yes.
and the thing about them too, is they're revised and expanded editions. So even if you own those books, you might want to get that because it's got a lot of new images and information in them. And the album series we do in, both digital, and also if you buy the collector's edition, you get the digital edition for free. So that's another reason why you may want to fork out a little bit extra for those digital editions.
Okay. Again, the website is beatle.net. Bruce and Al, this has been tremendous. Al, I'm sure I'm going to be seeing you very soon back on the channel or
Okay.
podcast.
Oh, I do need to put in one little plug though.
Okay.
Because the brand new issue of Beatle Fan Magazine is just about to be hitting mailboxes all over, and it has Bruce. You have 2 pieces.
I think so, yeah. I think I have a piece on Love Me Do, and then I have kind of a preview because I could only do a preview on the new album, the Revolver remix, and I primarily talk about a few of the tracks that I had heard on the outtakes, and also the wonderful mix that Giles has done. But the Love Me Do piece is kind of an interesting piece that approaches it a little bit differently. And the opening salvo is that, look, Love Me Do was recorded at Abbey Road by the Beatles 3 times, each time with a different drummer. And it kind of goes through all the other strange things about Love Me Do. And it was a really fun piece to write, and really enjoyed putting that one together.
And I've got a piece also on in the same package of pieces on Love Me Do. I have sort of a scene setter, which might be using in something else down the line.
Okay.
As Bruce knows.
It's always interesting to compare those 3 versions of Love Me Do. And, it really opened my ears up when I heard the one with Pete Best. And how he doesn't keep perfect time with it.
Oh,
Still,
I literally say he literally jumps off the bridge.
Yeah.
And it's, and look, and the thing about it is that, Pete wasn't a terrible drummer. It's just Ringo was a much better drummer. And it was like somebody eloquently said, when you're a quartet, that's 25% of your band. And so while the way the Beatles handled it, we can all criticize, but it was the right decision.
No question.
He was the final piece of the puzzle.
No.
And we sure are glad that he was a part of it.
Yes,
So
indeed.
Bruce and Al, thanks so much for doing this. We'll see you again soon. Bruce, you're always welcome to
Absolutely.
join other panel discussions here whenever you want. I'll reach
Well,
out
you
to
know,
you. Yeah.
you want to kidnap me to join some other people on a panel, I'll be happy to do so.
I'm good at kidnapping. Very
Mhm.
good at
All right.
it. Thanks so much. Thanks to everyone for watching. Please subscribe if you can, and we'll see you very soon.